Well, good morning. We are glad that you have joined us again this morning. Yesterday was a wonderful day in church and a wonderful opportunity to discuss the things that God is doing in our lives and wants to do in our lives. He never wastes a trial. He has a purpose for everything. And it's our privilege to participate in that purpose and to be faithful in the midst of this crisis. In order to keep contact with our church, we've opened up the opportunity for video conferencing through Zoom, and you can go to the link that was sent out, and that'll take you right to the sign-up list where you can sign up. Let me encourage you, make sure you've signed up before noon if you want to be in tonight's, and once those 10 spots are filled up, they're filled up. But I just want the opportunity to talk with 10 families several times a week, which will give me 30 or 40 families that I can be in contact with. We'll do it again next week. And you can ask me whatever questions you want. What are we doing? How are we handling this? What do you think about this? What should we do in light of this or that? What is the governor thinking? What are we doing on the state legislature? What are your contacts in Washington thinking? And so you can ask me whatever. You can ask me questions about the messages or the morning devotionals. So I want to encourage you, make sure that you're signing up for that if you would like to participate. Well, let me officially welcome each of you to the Daily Focus, and we're glad that you have joined us once again. Last Friday, I mentioned the fact that we would get into the specifics of chapter 4 in the book of James. And in that book, we've learned that God reminds us that our fighting and wars and our conflict and strife really comes from a selfish heart. And we're buying into the world's wisdom. We're buying into our selfish flesh and what we want and what we think. And it leads to a mistreatment of people. So instead of treating people with respect, treating them with kindness, we tend to see them either as problems standing in the way of what we want or what we think, or we see them as pawns to be used in a way that we want to use them in order to get what we want or to make them think what we think. And we see it, modeled for us in politics on the negative side, and it's a little frustrating for most of us. But yet, as Christians, we really should set a totally different example. And that example has been encouraged all the way through the book of James. The specifics that I'm going to talk about this morning are really taking these principles, these consistent themes throughout this book of the Bible, and putting them into some very practical, measurable steps. And so we want to look at James chapter 4 and be reminded what verse 6 says, and then to look at some of the specific things that will help us to obey. Verse number 6 says, "But he giveth more grace. Wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Be afflicted and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy into heaviness. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." So in the passage of Scripture, God is teaching us some very specific things that we can do to receive grace. And we know that grace is only extended to those who are humble. And so really, the idea here is, how do we model humility in order to get the grace that we all need? So many times we tend to let our ego trip, our pride get in the way, and then we blame everyone else for why things aren't going well and for why we are struggling in our Christian walk or in life in general. And the answer is that we're just being proud and selfish, but we don't want that to be the right answer. We don't want that to be reality. So we tend to blame everyone else. We blame circumstances. We blame situations. We justify our selfishness. And God says, listen, all that does is get you more distance from the very grace that you need in order to live the life God has called you and saved you to live. And so how do we get grace? Well, it's by being humble. Well, then how do we demonstrate humility? How has humility become a real reality in our lives? Well, he starts by saying, submit yourselves therefore to God. It starts the book of James this way, letting God be our authority, trusting Him in every situation, knowing that He cannot make mistakes, asking Him for wisdom as to how to handle the situations. And really, it is submitting ourselves to the fact that God is the authority. He knows what He's doing and He's right. And having the right view of God and having a proper and right view of ourselves. Well, he says, if you really want to demonstrate humility, you've got to let me be God. You can't be trying to play God. You can't be telling me what to do or what I can't do or what I shouldn't do or how I should handle every situation. That's not a way to get grace. That is not humble. That's rather arrogant. I like what Romans 11 teaches us when it says, who is God's counselor? He is so far beyond us in wisdom and knowledge that we can't even comprehend how much He knows, how powerful He is, how much He's in control. We can't even in our finite minds fathom it, let alone start telling God what He should and shouldn't do in every situation. And yet, how often do we do it? We do it because we're arrogant, because we're proud, because we're selfish. We know what we want, whether it's we tell God that He should heal somebody, whether we tell God He should meet this need this way, He should provide this, He should stop that, He should start that, He should allow this, He shouldn't allow that. I mean, we so many times in our prayers are not going to God showing dependence and submission, but rather our prayers are a bunch of orders that we expect God to fulfill. And that's not being humble. And you will not get grace if you're not humble. So God says, submit to God and resist the devil. That's that worldly philosophy. It's that worldly wisdom that we talked about that produces strife and conflict. He says, you know what, you've got to resist that. And the devil will flee from you, and the Spirit of God will begin to control you, and you'll be able to walk in wisdom, and there will be plenty of grace for the decisions you need, plenty of grace for the things that you face. And that's really what we need. And then he goes on to mention some other things. We need to cleanse your hands, ye sinners. In other words, there are some things, these are the actions we commit. We need to make sure the things we're doing honor God, show submission to God, show obedience to God. And if they don't, we need to cleanse our hands. We need to stop some things. It goes back to the passage there in James chapter 2 where he reminds us that what we say and what we do should match. To say you trust God and then be selfish with your actions doesn't seem to compute. It's not consistent. It doesn't work. And so he reminds us here that part of our reality in submission to God is cleansing our hands. It's also the process by which we draw nigh to God so He can get closer to us. And so we need to be very careful about our actions. But then he says, purify ye hearts, you double-minded. In other words, this is why are you doing what you're doing? We need to make sure we're careful in what we're doing. We also need to be honest about why we're doing it. And so he says you need to be honest with your heart and you need to purify it. You need to make sure that it's in line with God, that it's in tune with God, that you're really, truly interested in what God thinks rather than in what we want. And so God reminds us that we have a responsibility in our humility, not only in the things that we're doing and the things we choose not to do, but also in our heart's motivation for why we do it. And then he reminds us that we can't be double-minded. In other words, you can't have it both ways. You can't say you trust God and then lean on your own understanding. You can't say that you believe the Bible, but then chart your own path. You can't say that you want to please God, but do everything to please yourself. And God says, you know, those types of hypocrisies, that type of double-mindedness just leads to an instability in everything you're doing. You wonder, you have more questions and more questions as life goes on, and sometimes you begin to be your worst enemy, wanting answers, wanting wisdom, wanting direction, but rejecting the very source of it, which is God in His Word. And so he reminds us of these things that need to take place in order for us to be demonstrating humility, which then in turn provides the grace that we need. And then there's an interesting verse there in verse number 9 where he says, "Be afflicted and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to heaviness." He's really going back to this danger of selfishness. And he said, you know what, be very careful that you don't pride yourself in your own wisdom, that you don't, think yourself to be more smart than you really are. Don't act like everything is okay when it's not. He said, listen, what we need to do is be broken over our pride. We need to be broken over our selfishness. When we're fighting and having wars and strife and all of that, instead of priding ourselves and getting the best of somebody, using them as a pawn or removing them as a problem, this isn't about us. The conversation can't be about us. That's just rooted in pride, and pride got a basis. It's a way to be cast away by God, and though He may want to use you, and though He may want to bless you, and though He may want to give you grace, He can't because of pride. And so we need to weep and mourn over our selfishness and pride and embrace who God is, embrace with faith what God is doing, participate in His purpose, how He would ask us to do it with humility, that we might actually have the grace in order to be successful. You see, the whole Christian life is that way. And so he concludes in verse number 10 and just says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. He lifts us up by giving us grace that is sufficient to face everything. You ever been frustrated? You ever wonder where God is? You wonder why God isn't working, why God isn't hearing your prayers? It very well could be that we're just needing grace, but we're too proud to get it by humbling ourselves before God, doing the simple steps that He says to do so that He can lift us up in His time and His way. I hope you have a great day as we humble ourselves before God. May God bless you.